If you're thinking of buying a new graphics card, you should probably do so sooner rather than later. GPUs are finally at or below the MSRP in most regions around the world, and we're expecting that to change shortly. Memory prices are absolutely insane at the moment, and as we discussed in a recent video, an increase in the component cost of GDDR memory will see GPU prices rise quickly. A doubling of VRAM costs would likely lead to a $100 US price increase or more, and it only gets worse from there if DRAM prices continue to rise. Since we flagged this problem a week ago, there have been even more stories and rumors coming out backing up this analysis. Many in the industry are expecting price increases due to this very issue. At the moment, we're expecting price hikes in a couple of months, if not sooner, so it's best to get in before that happens. Current prices are based on existing stock manufactured before DRAM went all crazy, which you should capitalize on before it's too late. But what graphics cards are the best value on the market right now based on current pricing in 10 regions? That's what we'll be exploring in today's video after a word from our sponsor.
This portion of today's video is sponsored by NZXT's Performance Fans. Designed to combine premium cooling performance, impressive visuals, and ease of installation all in one. The fan frame and blades are constructed from a liquid crystal polymer, an advanced plastic that's much stiffer and more heat resistant than materials typically used in PC fans. This stiffness means the blades and frame don't flex or warp, even at high speeds and elevated temperatures, keeping airflow consistent and reducing vibration-related noise. Moreover, because liquid crystal polymer is so strong and precise when molded, the blades can be made thinner and positioned closer to the frame edges, which reduces turbulence and improves cooling efficiency. All models, even the multi-fan versions, feature just a single wire which includes a 4-pin PWM connector along with an RGB connector. All models also include aluminium side panels and subtle RGB lighting effects. Finally, all are backed by a 5-year warranty, so for more information, please click the link in the video description.
This is a follow-up to the graphics card cost per frame video we produced a couple of months ago, where we looked at pricing in 10 regions. We'll also be doing that today, but with updated information for November. These are the 10 countries that watch Hardware Unboxed videos the most. Last time we looked at pricing from one retailer in each region, but this time I've gone even more comprehensive. I'm looking at pricing at a much wider range of retailers to provide the lowest available price for a GPU in each country. In Australia, for example, I used a couple of price comparison websites to find the best GPU prices across a dozen or so retailers, and then I did the same for all 10 countries. From there, we've calculated real-world cost per frame data in each of these regions based on updated average performance data at 1440p, factoring in all of our latest testing. And that allows us to see how competitive NVIDIA and AMD are on a global scale. Let's start with a look at the United States. Right now, several models are available below the MSRP, including the RTX 5070 at just $480, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB at $400, the RX 9060 XT 8GB at $275, and even the RX 9070 XT has snuck slightly below its $600 MSRP. However, pricing for the RTX 5090 has gone the other way. These cards have shot back up to $2,500 US after being a few $100 cheaper in September. These price adjustments have created some interesting battles. Both the RTX 5070 Ti and RX 9070 XT are slightly below MSRP now, finally restoring the correct margin between these products. The 9070 XT should offer 16% cheaper cost per frame at MSRP, and in the US it's 17% cheaper, putting it in a reasonable position. The mid-range of the market has been shaken up, with the RTX 5070 falling to $500 or even as low as $480 during early Black Friday sales, which were running at the time we put this video together. Normally, the 9070 XT would offer better cost per frame and an increase in VRAM from 12 to 16GB, making it a great choice for just $50 more. But today, that gap is more like $100, and this makes the two models similar value. It also puts the 5070 slightly ahead of the 9070, so unless you are very concerned about the longevity of 12GB of VRAM, the 5070 is in its best position all year. In the US, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB is especially cheap and is the obvious choice compared to the RX 9060 XT 16GB. The Radeon model is 7% cheaper per frame, but that gap should be 14% at MSRP, and generally a single-digit margin is not enough for us to consider Radeon over GeForce, given the features gap between the two brands. With both models having 16GB of VRAM, it makes sense to spend $50 more on the 5060 Ti 16GB for access to DLSS 4, among other things. The entry level of the market continues to get shafted with inadequate VRAM capacities, but the 9060 XT 8GB dropping to $275 does make it decent value, as it's 16% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060. It's both faster and cheaper. The Intel Arc B580 with 12GB of VRAM is also a decent deal here at 12% cheaper per frame than the 5060, while the RTX 5050 is horrendous value and should not be considered at all until it falls well below its $250 MSRP. In Australia, we've finally started to see some pretty significant price drops for both the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT. The 5070 Ti in particular is now sitting at just $1,200 Aussie for the cheapest models, which is more than $300 below MSRP. The 9070 XT is also now below $1,000, making it 14% cheaper per frame, so right about where it should be based on the US MSRP. The 5070 is less competitive locally, easily beaten by both the RX 9070 XT and RX 9070 in value. The 9070 is 10% cheaper per frame and offers more VRAM, so that seems like the best choice for mid-range shoppers. Similarly, the RX 9060 XT 16GB is more competitive compared to in the US, priced at just 570 Australian dollars, making it 16% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB and the standout choice in the mainstream. The RTX 5050 is surprisingly cheap in Australia, with its $340 Australian dollar price for the cheapest models being equivalent to about $200 US. But that still doesn't make it good value in the entry level, where the standout choice is the RX 9060 XT 8GB and its 21% discount per frame compared to the RTX 5060. The Intel Arc B580 is reasonable as well, though it is 7% more expensive per frame than the 9060 XT 8GB, so it's a close battle between the superior performance of the 9060 XT or the higher VRAM capacity of the B580. In Germany, same situation as Australia and the US in the battle between the RTX 5070 Ti and RX 9070 XT. The 9070 XT is 14% cheaper per frame. The 5070 is okay here, priced roughly the same as the RX 9070, making the Radeon model 6% cheaper per frame. This is a very tricky battle here because there's the 9070 XT at a similar value to the 5070 and then the 9070 slightly cheaper. You can see why the 5070 is so popular because AMD isn't quite competitive enough, or at least they are not putting these 9070 models into a position where they are the obvious choice for mid-range buyers. The 9060 XT is 12% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti, comparing 16GB models for both. That's okay, but again falls just short of the 15% threshold we like to see between Radeon and GeForce, so in Germany the 5060 Ti is a pretty good choice. But in the entry part of the market, the best value GPU is the RX 9060 XT 8GB, which is 18% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060, and then of course we also have the Arc B580, offering good value for those after more VRAM. In the UK, we see a continued trend of the RX 9070 XT being about 15% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti, as the price battle between these models heats up and the 9070 XT finally reaches MSRP. Today, both of these models are cheaper than they were a couple of months ago. Like in Germany though, the RTX 5070 is still a very competitive model in this range, priced £30 below the RX 9070. This means all three of these mid-range cards offer about the same value in terms of cost per frame, so at the end of the day you're weighing the extra VRAM the AMD cards offer against the better feature set Nvidia offers. This is very much a better experience today versus potentially better experience in the future situation, which is why, at least in my opinion, the 9070 needs to offer better cost per frame today to make it worth buying over the 5070. The 9060 XT 16GB is not especially cheap in the UK, offering just an 8% cost per frame discount compared to the 5060 Ti 16GB. So like in the US, I would opt for the GeForce model here at £50 more. The RTX 5060 is also slightly cheaper than the 9060 XT 8GB, and ultimately this hands a decent win to Intel's Arc cards in this region. The B580 is 18% cheaper per frame than the 5060 and offers 12GB of VRAM, so at just £200 it seems the obvious choice. In Canada, we see the 9070 XT offering 13% cheaper cost per frame than the 5070 Ti, so that's a pretty typical result in line with other regions, but it's not especially amazing. The 9070 XT is 5% cheaper per frame than the 5070, and the 5070 is similar value to the 9070. So everything I just said talking about UK prices also applies here. Nvidia has kept the 5070 price quite competitive in a range of regions to put the squeeze on AMD. The mainstream market is a clear win to Nvidia. The 5060 Ti 16GB is just 13% more expensive in terms of overall dollar amount than the 9060 XT 16GB, and you're getting 7% more in cost per frame value. So the Radeon equivalent is simply not cheap enough to get a recommendation. That's about half the margin that there should be between these cards at MSRP. The 9060 XT 8GB is 9% cheaper per frame than the 5060, but again, the Arc B580 is looking pretty solid here at $330 Canadian, the same sort of price as the woeful RTX 5050, offering nearly 30% better cost per frame than that model and more VRAM, while also beating the RTX 5060 by 16% in value. While the 9070 XT typically hovers around 15% lower cost per frame than the 5070 Ti in other regions, the margin is smaller in India. Here the Radeon model is just 8% cheaper per frame, and while it is the more expensive GPU, the 5070 Ti makes the most sense for upper range buyers at this sort of difference. Meanwhile, in the rest of the mid-range, the 9070 holds a slim 4% cost per frame advantage over the 5070, with the 5070 and 9070 XT coming in with basically the same value. This is a common trend that we're seeing across all markets. The 5070 has gotten cheaper, so while the 9070 and 9070 XT should be 8% cheaper per frame at MSRP, these models are much closer in real-world prices. The 9060 XT 16GB is 14% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti 16GB, which is normal and is around the threshold that makes the 9060 XT the better buy. At the entry level, Intel's Arc series is not particularly compelling, with the B580 coming in at roughly the same price as the 5060 and 9060 XT 8GB, when it should be cheaper. The 9060 XT 8GB is a little expensive here with a slightly higher price tag than the 5060, which makes it just 9% cheaper per frame. That's nowhere near as compelling as it is in Australia, the US or Germany, where the margin in favour of the 9060 XT exceeds 15%. The Philippine market is very similar to India. Here the 9070 XT is 9% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti when comparing the best available prices for both models, which makes the 5070 Ti the obvious buy. The 5070, 9070 and 9070 XT all have roughly the same cost per frame, so once again it's a choice between more VRAM or better features in the mid-range. In the mainstream market, the 9060 XT is 14% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti, comparing 16GB models, so it's identical to India. We also see poor value for the Arc B580, and here for entry-level shoppers, the RTX 5060 is clearly the best choice, despite having just 8GB of VRAM. The 9060 XT 8GB is more expensive and therefore worse value, and the B580 is also 5% more per frame, which along with the weaker feature set offsets its VRAM advantage. The 5050 should still be avoided though. Brazil is the most favorable country we're looking at today for the Radeon RX 9070 XT, as it's 20% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti, making it the obvious choice. This is largely down to the 5070 Ti being poor value, rather than the 9070 XT being exceptionally good value, because the 5070 is much more competitive with these mid-range models. It offers similar to slightly better value than AMD's Radeon 9070 series, putting it in a good position to outshine Radeon with stronger features. While the 9070 XT is highly competitive against the 5070 Ti, the reverse is true for the 9060 XT 16GB versus 5060 Ti 16GB. The Radeon model is just 3% cheaper per frame, handing a decisive win to the GeForce card. You'd simply buy the 5060 Ti in this region for a small price premium. This is because the 16GB model of this Radeon card is much more expensive than it should be, costing 31% more than the 8GB card, when the margin at MSRP in the US is 17%. The 8GB card is okay value, but at only a 5% cost per frame discount compared to the RTX 5060, it's not a clear winner. Neither is the Arc B580, which is similar value to the 5060, making it a VRAM versus features battle. In Poland, we see the 9070 XT coming in 15% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti, so the same as other regions, and a decent position for Radeon. The 5070 is slightly worse value than AMD's mid-range cards, but not by much, once again creating a highly competitive market around this price point and performance tier. Poland has an MSRP-like difference between the 9060 XT 16GB and 5060 Ti 16GB, 15% in favor of Radeon, making the 9060 XT the better buy. However, in the entry-level market, the 9060 XT 8GB is only slightly better value than the RTX 5060, and in the top position we have the Arc B580, 9% cheaper per frame than the 5060. This is another highly competitive market with no clear winner, especially between Nvidia and Intel. The last country I'm looking at is the Netherlands. There's a 13% cost per frame advantage to the 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti here, which is typical. However, this is a rare example where the RX 9070 is clearly better value than the RTX 5070, with the Radeon model offering 10% lower cost per frame and more VRAM, while also being a little better value than the 9070 XT. It's not a huge win for Radeon, but you'd certainly consider the 9070 in this region over the 5070, whereas that isn't as much the case elsewhere. In the mainstream, we see the 9060 XT 16GB offering 16% lower cost per frame than the 5060 Ti, so Radeon is also a solid choice there. And AMD gets another win in the entry level, with the 8GB version of this card offering 14% lower cost per frame than the RTX 5060. The Arc B580 is 8% cheaper per frame, so it's also a decent choice if you want 12GB of VRAM, with no GeForce cards in this region being especially compelling. This appears to be because relative to other regions, the Netherlands are not seeing as many GeForce discounts below MSRP. So that's a look at cost per frame across 10 regions. To wrap this one up, I'm going to give a bit of an analysis on how things are looking for graphics cards on a more global scale than just US MSRP or US pricing. Initially, what's been really pleasing to see is that in most regions, GPUs are available at or below the local MSRP, making this one of the best times to purchase a card this year. And as I said at the start of this video, we're probably not going to see models much cheaper than this outside of the occasional Black Friday deals, with price hikes expected in early 2026. The battle between the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti is now more competitive than previous months, as the 9070 XT's price has improved to hit the MSRP. At MSRP, the 9070 XT should offer about 15% cheaper cost per frame, and this is the case in real-world prices across 8 of the 10 regions we looked at. Just 2 markets have the AMD advantage in the single digits, and on average, the Radeon card is 14% cheaper. That puts the 9070 XT into a position where we feel it offers good value and is worth buying, though I wouldn't go any further than that personally. It's good, but not outstanding value. AMD are doing just enough in this category. The mid-range market as a whole is much more favorable to Nvidia when you also add the RTX 5070 and RX 9070 into the mix. At MSRP, the 9070 series should be offering an 8% cost per frame discount and more VRAM at 16 versus 12GB. But in real-world prices, the 5070 is more competitive and on average is about the same cost per frame value as the Radeon cards. There are just 2 regions where the 9070 is 10% cheaper per frame than the 5070, and a couple of regions where the 5070 was cheaper. This makes the battle in the $500 to $600 US price range much more about features. Do you want a potentially more future-proof 16GB of VRAM, or Nvidia's stronger feature set including DLSS 4? In this category, I don't think AMD is making a particularly strong case. What helps Nvidia here is that 12GB of VRAM is quite usable in most of today's games, unlike, say, 8GB of VRAM. We think 16GB of VRAM will be better long term, but at what point will that advantage be realized, and is that enough of a factor to sacrifice access to Nvidia's features that can be used today? If AMD were offering more VRAM and better cost per frame value, like what should be the case at MSRP, the 9070 is a decent buy. But as the 5070 is now typically cheaper in most regions, enough to equalize the performance per dollar equation, it's much easier to recommend GeForce. AMD GPUs, in particular the 9070, simply need to get cheaper. Complicating this further is AMD's recent misstep relating to RDNA 1 and RDNA 2 long-term driver support. While they did quickly backpedal from their stupid decision to put RDNA 2 into the maintenance driver branch, which would have effectively ended game support, it does make me nervous about how long AMD will support their cards. The key selling point to a 9070 over a 5070 is VRAM, which matters long-term. But if AMD decides not to support these cards long-term, the longevity angle from having more VRAM is significantly weakened. Nvidia over the last decade has a better track record of long-term driver support, but on the other hand, drivers can't solve a lack of physical VRAM in future titles. The mainstream category is a fight between the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB and RX 9060 XT 16GB. What's interesting here is this market is almost a reverse of the higher end markets if we compare November to our last analysis in September. Back in September, we found the 9070 XT was 10% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti on average across 10 regions, and the 9060 XT was 15% cheaper per frame than the 5060 Ti. But these figures have now flipped in November. The 9070 XT is now 14% cheaper, while the 9060 XT margin has shrunk to just 11%. In half of the regions, the 9060 XT holds about a 15% advantage, matching what we should see at MSRP, but in the other half, it's common to see just a single-digit margin in favor of Radeon. This makes the mainstream a 50-50 proposition. In some regions, AMD are doing just enough to keep the 9060 XT 16GB in a position worth buying. In other regions, the value proposition isn't good enough, and the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB is the better buy, given both models offer decent VRAM, while Nvidia delivers, as usual, the better overall feature set. In the entry level, it's tough to recommend many of these cards, as several have fundamentally flawed 8GB VRAM buffers, and the RTX 5050 in particular is universally poor value. But if you must buy in this category, what we see is that on average, the 9060 XT 8GB is about 10% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5060. In some regions, the Radeon card is especially attractive, offering over 15% better value, but in 6 regions, the difference was less than 10%. Based on this, I'm more likely to recommend an RTX 5060 than an RX 9060 XT 8GB, even though I like neither of these cards. The other model in this battle is the Intel Arc B580, which offers 8% cheaper cost per frame than the 5060 across the regions on average, making it similar value to the 9060 XT. This really increases competition at the entry level because it essentially makes it a battle of adequate VRAM versus better features. Intel gives you more VRAM than the other cards, 12 versus 8GB, and better performance per dollar than the 5060, or similar performance per dollar to the 9060 XT. But AMD and especially Nvidia offer more mature game support and better features, along with a lower chance of driver overhead in systems with slower CPUs. It's incredibly difficult to pick a winner here, especially as the B580 is anywhere from 18% cheaper per frame than the 5060 to 8% more expensive per frame depending on the region, a very large variance. So that's it for our look at GPU cost per frame value in November of 2025. Perfect timing if you're thinking of buying a graphics card during all these upcoming sales, Black Friday, all that sort of thing. It should also have given you a bit more of a rounded look at how the GPU market plays out worldwide. Of course, in our reviews, we tend to focus on the US market as well as occasionally Australia, but you can buy graphics cards worldwide. So there's plenty of other interesting things going on, and that does change the picture for a lot of you who aren't buying in places like the US. If you do want to support our independent analysis and testing right here at Hardware Unboxed, the best way to do that is via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, monthly live streams, BTS content, Discord chat, and plenty of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.